We are recording. It is
Stay put.
August 26th, the year 2020. We released the podcast for the first time yesterday to the public, the first 10 episodes, and I'm very excited about that. And people have been responding well, so thank you. Please, if you're listening to this, post the link on your Facebook and other social media, because we are just fledgling podcasters.
We're mere tadpoles stuck to the underside of a leaf.
And today Patrick was wondering yesterday why so many people in California believe in astrology. And I was saying that a lot of people, when I grew up in Italy, it was taken very seriously. Like people who were, well-educated, well-read, intelligent people would not only read their daily horoscope, but also look at charts and like talk to astrologers. My father once, I asked him how he met his first wife, and he said, well, I met an astrologer who said, in September, you're going to meet your wife. So I was in Venice and I see this beautiful girl, and I said, that must be her. So I went up to her and I said, I know you're going to be my wife, so say hello to me. And they got married. So the astrologer was right.
I mean, the fates have been a character, right? In ancient Greece to Shakespeare to, I guess, even like modern fantasy thing. Like there's always this interesting kind of wise oracle, sage figure, and I don't know where that joy comes from, though. What I find so interesting is that people hate spoilers, but they don't mind being told their fate. Right, like you can't ruin a movie for someone, but they'd love to know what's going to happen to them in the next year. It seems inconsistent to me.
There's this great film by Michel Gondry about Noam Chomsky's linguistics work called "Is the Man Who Is Tall Happy?" And he just, most people who think of Noam Chomsky in popular culture talk about his political work, but really what he's most known for is his linguistics work. And so Michel Gondry decides to dive into that and ask him, as someone who knows nothing about linguistics, to explain what he's up to. And then he also goes into just kind of being an intellectual and being a curious person. And he asks very dismissively about his girlfriend. He says, what should I do about the fact that she believes in astrology? And he's very just like expecting Chomsky to just say, oh, what an idiot. But instead, he says, Isaac Newton was a lot smarter than either of us, and he believed in astrology. And human beings just have a tendency to look for connections and causes. That's where our brains are wired to do that. And so anywhere we can see that, we'll do it, even if sometimes it might be, not make sense.
Yeah, so there's I have some trepidation talking about this, in part because like if you're the scientific expert on on like a show about UFOs, right?
Yeah.
And even if all you say is they might exist, but we have no evidence, like end of story, period.
Right.
You're still on a show about UFOs, right?
Right.
And even if you're the skeptic. And so then talking about astrology, I think it is interesting in a few ways, only because it's clearly a phenomenon.
Right.
People clearly believe it. And I am kind of agnostic to, like, I am most interested in unpacking why people believe the things that they do. Mm-hmm. So to ignore it is to ignore like a huge swath of people's belief systems.
Right.
And it strikes me as not substantially different from all kinds of strange beliefs that we have that we might not have all kinds of evidence for, and like overfitting patterns, right?
I always think this when I hear Richard Dawkins being so like angry about, people being religious. And I think you're a biologist.
Yes.
These are human beings and they're biological creatures who have these beliefs. Why are you getting upset about it? I mean, if you believe in a deterministic universe, you should believe in the fact that whatever people believe is what they're going to believe in. That has a cause. And to have a kind of moral attitude almost seems more of a leap of faith than an acceptance of it and a desire to explain it, it seems. You get the same from Sam Harris, who doesn't believe in free will, and yet he gets upset about people having belief systems that don't agree with his. They'll say like, oh, people are, especially with religion and Islam and all this stuff. And I'm like, if you don't believe in free will and you believe in a scientific worldview, then you should just accept that people have this belief and you should try and explain it, if anything. Like,
Yeah.
I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I kind of, and it's not to be judgmental, but I want to know like what's there underneath the preference. I think people are just an accumulation of preferences, and there's something there. There's something driving it, and there are, there are standards and differences in degree and not kind. Like, we kind of like fortune cookies, right? Like that's not substantially different. Than being told. I guess I'm lumping astrology in with kind of like psychics as well, in terms of like the deep desire to be told that you're part of a pattern or that you're part of a causal chain. And
I was going to try and tie it in with conspiracy theories too, but go on.
Yeah, kind of. Well, so that's like overfitting patterns, right?
Right.
It's kind of like taking extremely low probability events and giving them higher probability than they kind of otherwise might have on an evidence-based measure.
And it's a desire to see order in a universe that might be more chaotic. It's back to our elegance thing. Like, it seems like people who believe in conspiracy theories often, even though they think the government is evil, they're having this amazing faith in the government being very powerful and all-knowing, and just a few people are doing all these things. And in a way, it's a very comforting thought, probably. And it's also to think that you're one of the few who has access to this truth, right?
Right. But I don't see it as substantially different than thinking the number 13 is unlucky, or various different kind of unheralded, unevidenced things that are like.
I get obsessed with I know that we can manifest things, right? Like if we think we're going to crash the car, that probably influences whether we crash the car or not, right? So then I worry, like, since I was raised with the number 13 being so unlucky, and like my dad saying you can't sit at the table if there's 13, I think, oh, we better not, because then I might manifest the bad luck. And my dad used to joke about this, say like, yeah, I'm not superstitious, it's bad luck to be superstitious. And it's true. Like if suddenly walking around thinking, oh my God, I walked under a ladder, something bad's going to happen, that could influence whether something bad happens or not.
Yeah, well, and I wonder about the brain's capacity to like imbue meaning after the fact, and often something will happen, a series of events will happen, and then the question is what caused those series of events.
Yeah,
there's a early 90s kind of Nature paper about a teenage girl with epilepsy who had her skull removed, right? And the surgeon is using an electrode to stimulate parts of her brain. They cause her to laugh. The nurse in the room says, "Why did you laugh?" She says, "The doctor just told a joke." Same thing, probing around. Teenage girl laughs again. Nurse says, "Why did you laugh?" And she says, "Oh, the painting on the wall is funny." That is it's a kind of misunderstood, misplaced observation, right? It's a kind of like false cause and effect.
Right.
The correct answer involves the stimulation of her motor cortex, which caused like her larynx to cause a pattern activation of neurons, which was perceived by those in the room as laughter. But that's not the answer they give. And I think the brain is doing this kind of confabulative work all the time. I think it was William James who, people just quote him. He's like the idiopathic, like when you don't know actually who said the thing, you just say William James said it because he probably said it. But I think he said this, which is just like, the Great Dipper does not exist in the sky. We look up at the sky, it's just stars. The pattern and meaning we see in it is exclusively the domain of human cognition and human perception. And to me, that means it's scientifically viable. Like to me, the interesting, like anthropological question is, why are there so many psychics in, I remember once trying to actually tabulate this in San Francisco. I think there were hundreds of like individual businesses dedicated to psychic readings. And to me, that's just like, why are there more of those than maybe gyms or health and wellness centers or salad bar? Like, why is this, what need is this feeding?
Yeah. That
there's so many of them, that there's an economy. And my kind of like skeptical side, or I don't know, I think it's like unlicensed therapy. I think it's extremely useful unlicensed therapy. Mm-hmm. And I think people need it, and for the same reason there are salons that are social, for the same reason salons and hair stylists were some of the first places to open after the coronavirus shutdowns, because people need community and they need someone to talk to, and that is part of their unlicensed therapeutic ritual.
Yeah.
And there's still so much stigma about actual therapy that you can go and you can get a reading, you can get an astrology reading, you can get a psychic reading. And
you think there's more stigma around actual therapy than there is around the psychic reading?
absolutely,
Really?
100%. To go to therapy means implies that there's something broken or wrong to many people. I don't think that. I think it's the most useful medical intervention that a person can have. But there's still a lot of stigma. I mean, think about, like, I went to the psychic versus I went to the therapist, between 1 and 2.
Yeah.
And
I thought both. I must admit, I would have a little bit of judginess about both, but a lot more about the person who went to the psychic. Maybe I'm just a snob.
yeah,
But
I mean but that's partly probably driven by your worldview and belief
Right.
system.
right.
And I mean, it's like, if you look at, okay, in psychology literature, there's this thing called the Big Five personality clusters, right?
Mhm.
In epidemiology, if you look at mental illnesses, there's a thing called, like, winter term birth.
What's that?
Winter term birth is when I think the woman is in the 3rd trimester during the winter months in various countries of high latitude, where there's kind of very stark winters. And there are some effects on cognitive development and even links to mental health conditions based on whether or not the fetus was born during the 3rd trimester. The argument being, like, viral loads. So the pregnant woman will get exposed to viruses throughout the pregnancy. And depending on which trimester the baby is in, the immune system will or will not, like, the baby doesn't have an immune system. The fetus doesn't have an immune system for a while. I think it's still, like, somewhere in the 2nd trimester where it's fully developed. Anyway, all that matters is that epidemiologists have found correlations between birth month and neuropsychiatric kind of personality clusters, right? Over in psychology, Big Five personality, it's clusters. It's clusters based on behavior. I don't see it as fundamentally categorically that different than what people try to do. You know, it just with the same clustering of people and personality types just based on some star alignment. To be perfectly frank, I don't think neuroscience has that much more to say about it than just looking up the sky and guessing.
But do you think that we have, like, as rational people, and specifically you as a scientist, do you have some sort of responsibility to try and guide people in a direction away from these misguided correlations? I mean, we obviously know that astrology is just wrong, right? I mean, there's just no evidence for it whatsoever. So do you feel like when you hear people talking about it, is there part of you that wants to say stop?
I think free unlicensed therapy or cheap unlicensed therapy is a great boon to the world. I think you were talking about Dawkins earlier and kind of religion and the sopophoric comfort of having a community and ritual. You know, religion provides a lot of confessionals, free therapy, free unlicensed therapy. So many of the kind of rituals of absolution and sin and are effectively just introspective acts, right? These are people that are trying to understand their place in the world and trying to do so with more and more evidence. And people gather evidence from different places. And so I don't a priori judge it hostily at all. Like, I mean, I have no way to really unpack the, like, tenets underlying my beliefs and my kind of explanations of causal chains. And they just happen.
I do think often the people on the left and people who are, supposedly rational still invoke the language and the moralism of religion in a very unself-conscious way. And I don't think you can really, if you're going to be consistent about a scientific worldview, I think it's difficult to believe in even things like free will and things like, moral right and wrong. And I believe in those things, but I don't think Hume said famously, you can't derive an ought from an is, right? And I think fundamentally that's true. I mean, I think people have tried, but I'm not convinced. I think if you're really going to be a scientist, you should be here I am saying should. But I think it's more consistent to be describing things as they are and trying to understand, why they are the way they are, rather than go around preaching to people.
Yeah.
Even if you're preaching, a scientific worldview. I don't think that anything in science tells you that you should, live your life according to scientific beliefs. I don't know if scientific beliefs tell you anything about how you should live. Truly scientific beliefs.
So do you think I have a moral imperative to correct or?
No, I think if somebody asks, right? No, you run that risk, right? And there is a certain arrogance that I think people like Dawkins often emit.
Yeah.
Right? And it's like, yes, I understand that you seem so unself-aware of the fact that you're going around and maybe that's why you're so irritated by other preachers, because you're a preacher yourself. Like you're preaching a worldview that you think people should adopt because you think the world will be a better place if they do, not because it fits some description of reality. So the reality is people believe these things, and so that would be more interesting to describe why. I see it all over the place, like Bill Maher and all these people get so upset about religion. I think it's a valid view. I think that if you think religion has done more harm than good, I think it's something worth arguing.
Right.
But I think that you need to build your moral structure from the place that's aware that that's what you're doing, at least. Right. That you're having a moral philosophy, and that moral philosophy is based on, yes, maybe it's based on a more realistic view of the world, but it's also based on certain preferences that I think aren't necessarily grounded in science.
For a long time, I thought there was a paradox to the reward structure of religion, where we clearly were the only species that seemed to behave at a kind of resource disadvantage while alive, for the hope and belief of a reward in the afterlife. That's something that most animals don't do, right? And like just quite literally looking at like physiology of reward and physiology of dopamine, kind of like tinkering with the reward structure and the feedback of reward, and how all these drugs can get in and impinge on that pathway, but then also how like pinball machines can, and casinos, and everything that we find to structure the rewards that we get in life. And I thought it was this unsolvable paradox. Like, how is it possible that a species could expect a reward? How does the brain encode the timing? Because what the brain is doing when it's creating these kind of reward pathways and reward feedback loops is it's timing when you should expect to get the reward, and then when and if you do, it kind of like tinkers with the mismatch, if there is one, or if it's you get the reward exactly at the time you suspect, it maybe kind of solidifies that potential connection. But like, how the hell does the brain encode a reward that doesn't come until after it's dead, until after it dissolves? And there's an obvious answer to the paradox, which is just the belief of the future reward is in itself a reward, right? And like that solves everything. And what I find most interesting about this is like the narrative. I don't know if narrative imprimatur is the right word, but like people are desperately seeking a story for their life. Yeah. And I used to get this in the toxo world when I did toxo research. What's parasite? Toxo? Yeah. So my PhD was on Toxoplasma Gondii, a little parasite that people get from cats, mice get from cats, and it gets into the brain of any mammal. And in the mice, at least, makes them not afraid of cats anymore, or arguably makes some of the mice not afraid of cats anymore. And, they started afraid of cats and they become actually attracted to it. And so that's supposed to be the life cycle, because the parasite can only reproduce in the cat. But people get it all the time. And we used to get these emails in the lab. And one in particular, I remember, was from a woman, middle-aged, who said she had retinal toxoplasmosis when she was like 9, which means it was in her eye. And so she obviously had it in her central nervous system, so it was in her brain. She would test positive for it in the antibody test. And she wrote an email saying, I have been through kind of like 2 rough divorces, and my kids and I don't really get along. It's been like multiple decades of this. Is it the parasite or is it me? Like, she was willing to give me narrative control. Right. And I don't see that as too different than looking up at the stars or asking a psychic or asking an oracle for narrative control. like, or giving them narrative control over your life and requesting to be put on a map, right? Like kind of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, that like the vortex where you go in and the only thing, it's like a little phone booth and you go in and the only thing it shows you is you are here, like your actual location with respect to the true scale of the universe. And every single person who leaves the booth commits suicide as soon as they find out their actual scale. I think people are desperately in need of like being able to place themselves. Mm-hmm. And often this comes with stories. We're a storytelling species. And so this kind of like medical narrative of, is it me or is it the parasite? This narrative of, in therapy, was it me or was it my childhood? You know, is it me or is it cancer? People have asked that all the time. I had a friend who had a glioblastoma and passed away from it. And he said that he wondered, like, are the thoughts that I'm having now me or the cancer?
Wow.
And it's a fascinating question, but it speaks to this need to have a story. And I think there's no quicker way to have a story than to be told by the fates, or be told by the stars, or be told by a doctor.
And there does seem to be no question that chance has a lot to do with what happens to us. And so calling it luck and bad luck does seem to fit, and some people do seem luckier than others. But why I feel 13? Super lucky, but then I knock on wood to make sure.
So why 13? Why, you know, like we.
So do you know this is our 13th episode?
Oh, that's perfect. Okay.
So we have to. Right. I just realized that.
That's beautiful. So something's going to sink it.
So there are great, cosmic coincidences, and
right.
This is one of them. Or we just happen to find patterns, right? And we're like, oh wow, 13. It's known as bad luck, and we're talking about superstition. This is anywhere you look, you can find these connections, and we're really good at that. We're almost too good at it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's it obviously serves us most of the time, but then sometimes that capacity, like I saw a little chart the other day, and it said data, and it had a bunch of little circles, and then it said information, and then the little circles were filled in, and then it said knowledge, and it had little like lines between the filled in circles, and then it said wisdom, and it had like more complex lines between them, and then it said conspiracy theory, and there was a unicorn drawn between all of these things with all these extra. So really it's just people's overactive capacity to find connections, and we need to explain that. I think as people of science, I think that's probably, it's more useful to explain it than it is to chide people, if just by purely pragmatic. And it might even have the effect of, moving people away from it if they understand why they believe it, rather than just being told by some arrogant scientist that they're dumb.
Yeah.
Which is what I feel often these people do.
Yeah. So one of my favorite kind of scientific theories in the last few decades comes from Lisa Randall and colleagues. She's a Harvard astrophysicist, and she noticed like an interesting periodicity between kind of large dinosaur and animal extinctions and the revolution of our solar system on the galactic plane. Mm-hmm. And so she's a dark matter specialist, and her argument was, if you take into account the some mass of dark matter that is expected, you would expect the Oort Clouds. So the Oort Cloud, do you know what this is? No. It's just a ring of rocks that circles our entire solar system. And she said around every 30 million years, based on the periodicity, so our solar system has an up and down motion in a sine wave as it revolves around the galactic plane. And she said, if I do these calculations, and every 30 million years, this Oort cloud should hurl a bunch of rocks into the solar system. And she looked back on the kind of fossil record, and there's this extinction events every 30 million years. And so the question is that a pattern? Are those linked? Is it a coincidence?
Right.
And the hypothesis is that it's not a coincidence, and that these are linked. And it's beautiful. I mean, she is I believe. I mean, I've interviewed her, but I don't know. I don't know her belief systems. But like, she's purely taking this from a scientific point of view. Like, are these cosmic events that have terrestrial impact, are they linked? And it made me consider it, like, totally kind of, I couldn't stop thinking about it for a while. And it made me think of a thought experiment in neuroscience, which is, if primates evolved, imagine we evolved society and language and math and IMAX and absolutely everything. All of society evolved, but we didn't have eyes. Okay? No eyes. Like, we figured it all out otherwise. Would we ever, and if so, how, discover the moon?
Yeah, maybe from the tides or...
Right. So that's exactly it. We would notice strange things happening.
Right.
We would notice that there are periodicities in Earth biomes, maybe female cycles, right? Across many, many species, maybe the tides, maybe all kinds of animal species that seem to do a thing, make coyotes howling at only the full moon versus the thing. Like, why? You know, like at some point we would be able to gather all of these observations.
Yeah.
But the logical leap that it would require, if we had no eyes and none of us had ever seen anything, to think, oh, well, there's a large sphere in the sky, which you don't even know what sky means. You don't know how high the sky is, right? When blind people, or we ask a congenitally blind person how high the sky is, and they don't know the answer to that. And so then, like, how would we develop it? And I think the interesting thing is that there would probably be so many wrong theories along the way. Maybe theories that explained where things would be, but not why.
Yeah.
And I think that's the crux, that a lot of star charts do, and a lot of kind of psychics, they'll explain where things will be, but not necessarily why, because you don't need the why, because the why is really difficult to come to. So I think what would happen is, like, in the same way that we kind of have detectors that detect kinds of electromagnetic radiation that are outside our visible phenomenological spectrum, right? Like, we can see an infrared if we have a little camera, and we can see UV and Wi-Fi and all. There's all these, like, spectrum that we can collect. And we can transduce them into something that's manageable and that we can perceive. So I think at some point someone might create like an acoustic telescope, and they would, so it takes in light, but it outputs sound.
Yeah.
And maybe that person, like Galileo, right, would, instead of inventing the telescope, would invent this acoustic telescope. And you'd point it at the sky, and it would be like empty, empty, empty. Maybe clouds would have a certain sound to them. And then at some point you get this, you just, like, as you scanned the sky with this acoustic telescope in these human primates without eyes, right, you just start to see this shape over and over and over in the sky that kind of like waxed and waned with crescent and full. And I think you might be able to image it without seeing it. You might be able to acoustically understand in this kind of thought experiment what it is. But to link it to all of the observed phenomena is not an easy task. It's fascinating to me to consider the kinds of wrong theories that people would come to if something fundamental was missing from our ability.
I mean, how many potential senses are we missing? We have these five that seem sort of arbitrary, and they're so utterly distinct from each other that you could never deduce one from the other. And then you also, it makes you wonder, well, maybe there's a 6th, a 10th, a 100th sense that is as important as vision is, that we just happen not to have. So then you think, like, okay, how much of the world am I actually having access to with these 5 arbitrary senses? There may be thousands more, and it makes one think that maybe our perception of reality has very little to do with what reality actually is like, right?
Yeah, and to carve our body schema out of the incoming sensory information of these 5 senses, right, it requires that the brain try to piece together the coincidences, right? It requires that the brain try to piece together when it moves its eyes saccades 3 times a second and the visual world shifts a bunch. In order for it to appear stable, which it does to us, every time we move our eyes.
That's an illusion.
Of course, yeah, right? It's totally an illusion. What that means is that there's a well-developed and well-understood coincidence between moving your eye exactly this degree at exactly the speed and the expected shift in the visual world. And the brain, in order to cancel that out, has to be able to predict and understand these coincidences. So all it effectively is a coincidence detector. And so when we talk about conspiracy theory, various different beliefs, certain types of maybe even paranoid schizophrenia, certain types of overfitting of patterns, certain types of mismatching. It's effectively just this desperate need for our brain to understand coincidences, maybe just skewed slightly in some direction that's not always wrong, right? We were talking about depressive realism in an earlier episode. It's not always wrong. Yeah. It might actually be more accurate to misperceive some of the coincidences.
And what do you think as a neuroscientist I remember Aldous Huxley and Timothy Leary and a lot of other people in the early research days of psychedelics said that the brain was actually a limiting device. And I think you're kind of confirming this in different language, saying that we need to posit this false sense of stable separate objects and all this kind of stuff. And what the psychedelic does is it kind of just momentarily removes the filter and floods you with the reality of how, or maybe just a little more of the reality of how unstable and all these different energies coming in are. That's definitely the sense I've had when I've gone far with like DMT or something, is there's a sense that like, okay, this is not a way that I can function. I can't like go and eat and procreate and do the things that as a human I'm supposed to do, but I'm getting a moment to witness what the world is like, possibly even more so than it is when I'm focusing on more practical aspects of being human.
So if you anesthetize the eye muscles, so that they can't move anymore, they can't do the saccades, whatever you're looking at will just, so you're stuck,
right?
Eyes straight forward. It'll just disappear into a cloud of grayness.
What will disappear?
Your entire visual field.
Really?
Yeah. So if your eyes are prevented from moving,
you can't see.
You can't see. So this whole idea that psychedelics unravel the true door of perception, whatever. No, your eye, like there is no thing there. Like it requires the movement and it requires the coordination of the movement with its expectation. Mm-hmm. And so if it's just looking straight forward, the world just disappears.
But that's not what's happening when you're on psychedelics, right?
No, but I'm saying that's a kind of,
I heard it was amplifying the connections. Like recent MRIs, don't they say that the psychedelics are actually making the neurons more active?
100% of the cells in your brain are active 100% of the time.
Okay.
There's no wiggle room.
But you can have more connections, right? Or no? When you're in less conscious, aren't you having less connectivity? If someone's in comatose, is there not less happening than if they are hyper stimulated, for example?
You could certainly disrupt feedback loops and network connectivity in a way that appears to cause a prioritization in some networks that are usually inhibited, for example, mm-hmm. Which would appear to be more activity in one region.
Okay.
But that's like the check, the like release of an inhibition, right? You can take a chicken and give it dinosaur teeth by removing the inhibitory gene, which prevents dinosaur teeth from growing, right? Yeah. So that's effectively just the same thing that's happening in these network connectivity kind of results.
But I heard I read a study somewhere that was saying like the reason we all believe like we understand the meaning of life when we're on LSD is because though it's hyper activating a lot of this connectivity, and it's making us then see, oh, everything makes sense. It's all one. Like it's just disinhibiting, or it's over activating our seeing of connections.
It's just it's the language of like hypo, more or less, that I find like humorally troubling. Uh-huh. Back in the humor days. Just this idea that there's more or less. It's about, I think it will be about, so like 2100 neuroscience will not talk about brain regions. I think brain regions will just die out from the vocabulary.
Why?
The reason being, we talk about them because we find geography simple and easy to understand. Like countries make sense to us. Uh-huh. So when we look in the brain, we're like, oh, maybe there's territories. It's like we're railroad barons carving it out. And when like the entire 20th century neuroscience, basically they have this, I call it like a slice chauvinism, where effectively in order to understand the brain, we had to have anatomy. And so people took slices of the brain and then laid those down and then looked at them. And when you do that, if you take like 2D slices of a three-dimensional structure, you're going to have a slightly biased view of what's actually happening. And as well, you're going to prioritize something. And what people have prioritized is the cell body. right? It's because the like little tendrils of every single neuron, which go all around the brain, get completely severed when you just look at it as a slice, right? So you lose all of its three-dimensional structure. It's like looking at a cross-section of a tree, for example. But what you really need to know is the entire 3D structure of all of its branches and leaves. And so the 20th century neuroscience was mostly slice chauvinist, where all we did was look at slices and infer from that what the brain must be. The natural conclusion from that is that cell bodies matter because it just happened to be all that we could see. And I think if you ask, again, a 2100 neuroscientist, they'll just talk about it in terms of networks instead of regions. And I think that will change substantially our understanding of like, oh, okay, well, this region is more or less active during this drug, during this state of being. We'll just have a completely different vocabulary, and we'll look back on this as like Babylonian times.
Yeah, you think that that we are in Babylonian times when it comes to
I think
science, right? Like we are. Oh, just to unpack this before, because I was so struck when I first met you and you said this. You said if you compare our understanding of the brain to our understanding of the stars and the constellations, back to astrology, then we are in a time before the invention of the telescope, basically. So if anything, we might be, in 1500 or the Dark Ages, or even earlier, like Babylonian times, that we're just looking at the sky, right?
Yeah.
And understanding nothing.
I think the fMRI machine, which is effectively magic, but it's like the lens grinder to learn, people had to learn how to grind glass before Galileo and his father could make telescopes. Mm-hmm. But I think we're in the Babylonian era, and I say that very carefully because at the time, the time the skies were a lot clearer, right? And everybody looked up at the sky, and all you could do is track it. You could track where stars were, you could track where they would be next, and you found these patterns, right? There's cycles over and over. And I think when you have a cycle, you're going to have a lot, like a cyclically occurring event in nature has a lot of room for a lot of like mismatched coincidences to fit in there. So I think that explains most of the psychology of a lot of this kind of astrology alignment, etc. But the Babylonians, they would have these beautiful star charts because they needed to know how to sail that were good for 1,000 years. People used their star charts for 1,000 years, sailors would. Yeah. And they were very good at knowing where the stars would be next. But they had theories like the Epicycle Theory, which is, well, there's this weird thing that happens, which is the planets appear to occasionally move backwards in the sky, right? If you track them, they'll move forward, they'll move backwards. And people were trying to come up with all kinds of explanations. And so they posited large epicycles, large unseen bodies, basically more planets, that would kind of explain why it is the case that these planets would sometimes go backwards in the sky. And so instead of basically taking the simplest version, which is we don't know, they came up with a bunch of theories, and they posited entire large gravitational massive bodies that were perturbing these planets and making them go backwards. And I think in neuroscience right now, if you put someone in an fMRI scanner, first of all, they're laying on their little side, and that's a completely unnatural thing. They're in this sarcophagus, which is a completely unnatural thing. They can't move, they can't talk, it's loud as all hell. And you show them a face. The part of their brain called the fusiform face area will light up. And what does that tell us, though? That's the star chart. That's telling us where brain activity will be, but it tells us nothing about why.
Right.
And I think, that will be true 1,000 years from now, in the same way the star charts were useful for 1,000 years, that the brain activity happens there when you show a mammal a face. But why? We have no idea. And so a lot of these, it's too easy in like this meta-inductive way, but I just dismiss most theories of the brain because I just imagine them as epicycle kinds of theories. On
a slight tangent, there's Sean Kelly, who's professor of philosophy at Harvard, who was a student of Dreyfus's. He talks about the difference, the more impoverished way the world shows up for us in the technological era. We think of ourselves as just knowing so much more, and therefore our life must be richer. But what keeps happening as these technological devices kind of tell us more and more how to behave and what to do, the worlds and ourselves start to show up as less meaningful. And the great example that he brings up, which you reminded me of right now, is if you compare us looking at our GPS to tell us where to go, and the great Phoenician, explorers and sailors who would look at the stars. And they had this deep understanding of what the stars told us about our position in the world, right? And so the great navigator, had this incredible skill and was respected for having that skill and was necessary and needed and had a purpose in their life because that's what they did. And then they looked at the stars and they saw nothing but meaning. They saw, this is where this is telling me which way, literally, which way I have to go in my life, right? And you compare that to like, turn left now, turn right, and you can just be completely zonked out and not paying attention to anything else. And suddenly the world is less meaningful, literally. Like it's not hocus pocus or anything. It's not just an opinion. It's just like the world either shows up as illuminating a path or it doesn't. And in this sense, the kind of view of linear progress is questioned in a way that doesn't necessitate any belief in superstition or anything like that. It's not like you have to believe in astrology to have this view of the meaningful stars. It was a fact about the world that the navigator knew something about the stars that most of us today do not know. If anything, we have an aesthetic experience, which is like, oh, wow, pretty, right? Not very deep, right?
Yeah.
An aesthetic experience of art, even according to Kierkegaard, even Heidegger, or of religion even, it only goes so far in, if you just look at a painting and you think it's pretty, you're not really having an experience of what the painting is supposed to do and in showing you what it is to be human, or what it is to be, the shoes of Van Gogh's shoes of the peasant, and how it might that held up to, what it was to be a farmer in that time, and they saw those shoes and there was meaning in them. It's very different than saying like, oh, what a pretty picture, right? And so the risk right now is that you have just an aestheticized worldview where each thing is just as good as anything else. You can listen to one song, but you might as well listen to another. And therefore all songs are the same, right? Versus a time where this song is what you listen to in the church at that time. And then that song, as part of that ritual of going to the church, it said something to you about what it was to be human at that time. Now I can listen to Bach. I can listen to, great choral music, and then I can swap it for, the latest electronic music, and they just evoke a slight different sensory response in me, but there's no meaningful difference between them.
And do you see that, like the kind of ability on your iPod, or do people have iPods anymore? What do they have? iPhones.
Yeah.
To be able to like digitally switch genre so quickly, as similar to being like the Venetian navigator who maybe then used his GPS. So, I mean, if you imagined music was still live and had to be live, you would encode the space in which you heard it. So if you could only experience music live back in the day, the kind of genres would probably play in different theaters or different environments, different kinds of music. You'd have your gypsies outside and you'd have your Bach concertos inside. And your brain, it craves spatial layout. It craves putting memories within a box, and it wants to remember that box. There's a massive amount of metabolism of the brain is dedicated to like tracking where you are in relation to the walls around you, so that you can recall that. And I think often that there's a threshold that is crossed when I feel comfortable and at home in a new place, and it's when I'm lost for the first time, or a little bit after having recovered from being lost for the first time, in part because only when lost does your brain piece together all of the walls, sides, outdoor trees, landmarks, etc. of a city, of a town, of a small new place it's in. It requires that spatial layout. And to be able to like just have your headphones in and digitally switch song to song, you completely obliterate the spatial layout of the thing. And I wonder how it encodes.
That's going to happen with the VR. I mean, when you're going to be walking around 100%. In one beautiful spot, and then you're like, oh wait, I could just as easily be somewhere else, and the stars look pretty like this, but they could look some other way. And it's happening now with like distance learning because of COVID, that people can't go to university. I heard someone the other day saying, look, if I knew that Salman Rushdie was about to give a talk in the next building, I'd go over there.
Right.
And I wouldn't walk out halfway through. I'd be really curious about what he has to say, right? But if you tell me that he's giving a lecture on YouTube and it's available also tomorrow and it'll be available in a year, and I can equally watch anything else, like, no, I don't need to listen to Salman Rushdie right now. Like,
and that the walls of your room stay the same. You know, like you don't get any of the uniqueness of watching someone in a place in a different room. Yeah, so I think 2020 is going to be like, people's memory of this year is going to be obliterated and fascinating and probably studied for 20 years because it's all the same, because people are experiencing new things within the confines of the same spatial layout.
That said, though, like it is bringing us back to the specificity of the circumstance that we're in, right? I mean, I've found myself more connected to my environment and my immediate friends, and the interactions I've been having have acquired more meaning, because also there's this vulnerability to it, and you have this sort of background fear of getting ill, and that also limits possibilities, right? So it's all about these limitations that then infuse. If you have it's called optionalization, or like the idea that you have infinite options with no basis on which to choose one over the other. And if you have infinite time and no death, then everything appears as equally meaningless, right? So there's this, I think, a compelling story to be told for the fact that we need an end, and we need to have each choice that we make necessitate the death of the other choices, and therefore stand out as illuminated. And that's
do you think the belief systems that adhere to what we talked about earlier in the episode, like astrology and psychics and things like that, do you think that is at the cost of other kinds of belief systems? Like that is the one that has to be elevated. So do you believe something that you don't have evidence for?
So when I was at Berkeley, there was an astronomy professor who said some things about astrology, and someone raised their hand and said, how on earth can you, a man of science, believe this absolute nonsense? And he said, oh no, I don't believe it at all. But the amazing thing is it works even if you don't believe it. And that's how I feel. And there's probably some deep, reasons. Like, I've been told since I was a kid that I have these Scorpio, the personality traits. And so I joke, like, yeah, as a typical Scorpio, I don't believe in astrology, for example. And so I think that these are reinforcing things, and they're self-perpetuating, just like believing something is bad luck probably does make it bad luck. And therefore it is bad luck to be superstitious. And astrology does work in a certain degree, even though it absolutely shouldn't.
Do you have a superstition, though, that is unique to you? That is yours and yours alone?
No, I think that just like there's no private language, there's probably no private superstition. It's somehow fed by cultural beliefs, I think. I don't think this absolute like freedom and individuality is a possibility.
As a kid, I genuinely thought that the act of naming my pets was what started in them like a telomeric clock that led to their ultimate death, and that if I'd never named them, they would never die.
Oh, there you go. You have this
because because I named everything, and then it would eventually die. It was like the only thing that was one-to-one in the match between the dogs and the birds and the goose and the only thing in common was that I named them.
Right.
And like, what is that? Is that overfitting? Kind of. Yeah. I mean, yes, obviously.
Totally. Yeah.
But what is this black cat thing? What is this number 13? What is the number 7? And
I will definitely, especially when I'm in Italy, and I'm more infused by the cultural practices of that, and I'm walking down this medieval road in Vignanello, and I see a black cat like about to cross my path. I will avoid it. I will either try and walk in front of it and make sure it doesn't cross my path, or if it does cross my path, I might walk another way.
Maybe it's Toxoplasma.
Right.
From the cats. There was this woman who, so at Stanford, when a new faculty came in like the English or literature department, and there's this thing called, I think, the ice cream house, or maybe only Blakey called it that. But anyway, new faculty would come and they'd have to stand up and introduce themselves. And there's this woman, new faculty from France, I think in the philosophy or French department. And she got up and she was explaining herself, and she just talked mostly about the journey of her and her cat from Paris to Palo Alto, from Paris to Stanford. And I asked her, she was at the table I was sitting at, and I just asked her why she liked her cat, and she gave like 10 reasons about its independence and its beauty and its grace and all of these things. And I, in the back of my head, knew that France had one of the highest rates of Toxoplasma infection in the world, which may or may not make you like cats more, arguably, if it's in humans. And nowhere in her introspective access would she have said, Well, and I also might have I have a 50% chance of having a parasite that may or may not cause me to be more attracted to the smell of the urine of cats. Therefore, that is one of the reasons, with 0.01% probability of why I like my cat. So it's about the kinds of things that you understand, know, and can perceive in the world, and then how it is that you then take that and create a story and an explanation about what is guiding you, why you like the things you do, why the stars are where they are, why black cats are bad luck, why 13 is bad luck, why some things are good luck, why Holduvok in Iceland. Do you know this thing where the entire country of Iceland believes in these tiny little
elves,
invisible elves, and you can go into the penis museum and they have jars of the ghost penises, and it's just empty jars, and they'll reroute highways around the rocks that contain Holduvok kind of habitats. What is that? Is that cultural psychosis? Is that superstition? Is it just the shared belief creates some sort of fealty? That there's got to be a reason that this is over and over and over and over in country after country and group after
having
group.
been in Iceland too, there is this kind of awe that nature evokes that makes you want to believe more things. It's incredible. In a world that's completely created by man in predictable ways that inspire less and less awe. And, as we enter, contemporary life is full of more and more places that are highly, highly predictable and the same everywhere.
Right.
That does not put you in a mood of openness to miracle and other, far-fetched beliefs. But maybe we're losing something in that too. Maybe it's being in a posture of awe is a richer life, and maybe it's looking up at the stars and seeing that we're connected by some sense of, I don't want to just call it wishful thinking, but I think maybe it's just something that we crave because we want to live in a world and a universe that's full of meaning. We don't want to just see empty banality and sameness and predictability.
Yeah, if William James was wrong and we just looked up at the sky and saw individual dots and points of light that had no meaning, no connection whatsoever, that'd be a tragedy.
Yeah. On that note, let's call it a day. See
Till
you tomorrow.